The winding dirt track was a promise, or perhaps a threat. It was certainly a test. My old sedan, packed to the rafters with canvases and the desperate hope of a last-ditch effort, groaned under the strain, pebbles spitting from beneath the tires. I hadn't painted anything true in months, not since the wellspring had dried up, leaving behind only a bitter dust. This manor, isolated and forgotten, was supposed to be my reclamation. My muse. My salvation. The agent, a sharp-faced woman who smelled faintly of mothballs and stale coffee, had called it a unique opportunity. I called it a bargain that screamed haunted, but I was past caring. My studio apartment in the city had felt like a cage, the constant hum of traffic a mockery of inspiration. Here, silence was the main commodity, and a gaping maw of a house that felt older than time itself. When the tree-line finally broke, revealing the manor, I gripped the steering wheel tighter. It wasn't just old, it was decrepit. A leviathan of blackened stone and sagging timber, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy, moss-laden brows. Gables twisted skyward, sharp as broken teeth. A forgotten relic, choked by overgrown ivy and a pervasive sense of melancholy. Perfect, I thought, a perverse thrill stirring in my gut. Perfect for me. The air inside was thick, cold, and smelled of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something metallic and faint, like old pennies. Every floorboard sighed under my weight as I carried boxes through the cavernous foyer. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminated by a sun already dipping towards the horizon. The vastness of the place swallowed every sound, making my own breathing feel unnaturally loud. I chose a room facing west, hoping for sunsets to paint. It was the least forbidding, with a tall, arched window that promised a view, even if it was currently obscured by a persistent, grasping vine. As I unpacked my brushes, setting up a makeshift easel, I heard it for the first time. A faint scraping sound, like claws dragging across stone, coming from somewhere deep within the house, perhaps the basement. Old house settling, I muttered, mostly to myself. My voice sounded thin in the echoing space. Just the wind. I tried to ignore the subtle shifts in the air, the way the temperature would drop abruptly in certain corners, or the faint scent of something like stagnant water that would waft through a supposedly sealed room. I attributed it to poor insulation, drafts, a decaying plumbing system. Anything but what my instincts whispered. My first few days were a blur of unpacking and exploration. The manor was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, sealed-off passages, and staircases that led to nowhere but crumbling walls. I found a library with shelves of moldering books, a ballroom with a cracked ceiling that threatened to collapse, and a vast kitchen with a cast-iron stove that looked like it hadn't seen a fire in a century. Each discovery fueled a strange excitement, a sense of unearthing secrets. But there was always that underlying hum of unease, like a discordant note played just beyond the range of hearing. One afternoon, chasing a particularly unsettling draft, I found myself in a section of the manor I hadn't yet explored. It was an annex, a squat, windowless addition to the main structure, barely visible from the outside. The door leading to it was heavy oak, bolted shut with a rusted iron bar that took all my strength to dislodge. Beyond it was a narrow, unlit corridor, leading deeper into the annex. It was a smell I couldn't quite place, but it prickled the back of my throat. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing rough-hewn stone walls, unlike the plaster and wallpaper of the main house. This part of the manor felt older, cruder, built for a different purpose. The corridor ended in another heavy door, this one unbolted, merely latched. I pushed it open, feeling a strange blend of trepidation and curiosity. The room beyond was large, rectangular, and utterly barren save for a single, long, scarred wooden table bolted to the floor in the center. Iron rings were set into the stone walls at regular intervals, and the floor was rough concrete, stained with what looked like ancient, dried spills. This wasn't a cellar, or a pantry, or a servant's room. This felt like a place designed for containment. A single, grime-caked plaque on the wall, barely visible beneath layers of dust, read, "Intake Holding Area." I ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, a shiver tracing my spine. What exactly was taken in here? What was held? The rings on the walls. The stains on the floor. My imagination, always vivid, began to conjure images I quickly tried to suppress. It was just a weird old storage room. A place for receiving goods, perhaps. Maybe the previous owner had a strange hobby. Not the manor settling, this was different. Deeper. The sky outside, which I could glimpse through a crack in the corridor door, had turned an angry bruised purple. A storm was rolling in, fast and fierce. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack of thunder directly overhead, the meager power in the manor flickered once, twice, and died. The flashlight in my hand was my only beacon, a fragile shield against the encroaching black. My breath hitched. Not the scraping I'd dismissed earlier. This was a soft, wet thump. Like something heavy, yielding, being dragged across the concrete floor outside the intake holding area, in the corridor I had just traversed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My rationalizations evaporated like smoke. The wind didn't make that sound. The house settling didn't make that sound. I spun, flashlight beam jumping wildly, illuminating only the empty, stained walls of the intake holding area. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural sigh that seemed to echo not from the corridor, but from within the very stones of the room around me. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, a shiver tracing my spine. What was held? The thought was a cold knot in my stomach. The rings on the walls. The stains on the floor. I pulled my hand back, the wood feeling strangely cold, despite the clammy warmth of the stagnant air. The flickering beam of my flashlight, my sole companion in the vast, consuming gloom of the manor, danced across the unsettling scene. I told myself it was just an old, neglected room, perhaps a storage area for a forgotten industry, or a particularly grim pantry. Anything but what my gut insisted it was. The storm outside had only intensified since I'd arrived, a relentless drumming against the window panes, a mournful howl through unseen cracks. It seemed determined to drown out any rational thought, leaving only the echoes of my own unease. A sudden, sharp crack from deeper within the house jolted me. It wasn't the wind, not a branch. It sounded like something heavy, something wooden, giving way. My breath hitched. I swung the flashlight beam towards the doorway, its light swallowed by the profound blackness beyond. I stood frozen, listening, straining to differentiate the house's groans from something more deliberate. Nothing. I tried to convince myself, to anchor myself in logic. But the feeling of being watched, a prickle on the back of my neck, was growing stronger, more insistent. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. I needed to get out of this room, this intake holding area during power outage, as soon as possible. Not from within the walls, not from the floor above, but under the very floorboards I stood on. The sound was unmistakable, the grating of wood against wood, heavy and deliberate, as if something massive was being dragged or shifted. My eyes darted to the floor, then back to the doorway. There was no one else here. I was alone. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. The scraping came again, a slower, more drawn-out groan, directly beneath the heavy table in the center of the room. My gaze locked onto the table. But now, as I watched, its far end, the one furthest from me, seemed to subtly, almost imperceptibly, shift a fraction of an inch. A faint, new scratch mark appeared on the grimy floorboards beside one of its massive legs. My mind reeled. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the house settling. This was something else. Something in here with me. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent I hadn't noticed before, damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old, dried blood. My stomach churned. Driven by a desperate, foolish need to understand, I crept towards the table, my flashlight beam fixed on the area where it had shifted. I knelt, ignoring the dust and grime, and ran my fingers along the edge of the table leg. The floorboard beneath it felt slightly raised, loose. My heart thudded. With a surge of adrenaline, I pried at the edge with my fingers, then with the flat end of my flashlight. It gave way with a soft creak, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside, nestled in the disturbed earth, was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle, and a handful of yellowed, brittle newspaper clippings. My hands shook as I pulled them out. The journal felt ancient, its pages almost fused together. I carefully opened it, the dry paper rustling like dead leaves. The script was faded, spidery, but legible. The first entry I could decipher was dated nearly a century ago. It spoke of the new intake, of the preparations for the harvest of despair. My eyes widened, scanning the frantic scrawl. The journal belonged to a former caretaker, a man who, it seemed, had witnessed unspeakable things. He wrote of the others, not people, but a presence, a hunger that fed on sorrow, on fear, on the utter dissolution of the human spirit. The clippings detailed a series of disappearances from the surrounding villages, all dating back to the same period. They spoke of individuals, often those already struggling, burdened by grief or financial ruin, who simply vanished without a trace. The desperate ones, the journal called them. They were brought in, prepared, and then offered. Offered to what? The rings on the walls, I now understood with sickening clarity, were not for storage. They were restraints. I didn't want to think about the stains. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was a trap, a mechanism designed to cultivate and feed something truly monstrous. The entity wasn't a ghost, it was a parasitic force, a malevolence born from the collective suffering of generations, thriving on the very despair it created. I wasn't just in an old manor, I was in a predator's lair, and the predator was awake. The scraping sound from beneath the table had stopped, but a new sensation prickled at my skin, a heavy, suffocating pressure, as if the air itself had solidified around me. It knew I was here. It knew I had found its secrets. The air in the manor had grown heavy, thick as old velvet, since the last flicker of light died. I'd been fumbling my way through the suffocating blackness, a single, sputtering lantern my only companion, the shadows it cast doing more to distort than illuminate. The rings on the walls, the stains on the floor, they'd been a prelude, a macabre invitation to something far worse. My gut churned with a mixture of dread and a strange, desperate curiosity. I had to know. What was taken in here? What was held? My lantern, its wick barely clinging to life, threw weak, dancing light ahead as I descended a set of creaking, uneven stairs. The smell intensified down here, not just the dust and mildew of neglect, but something deeper, an acrid, metallic tang underlying the rot, like ancient blood and forgotten tears. I pushed through a warped, heavy door that seemed to resist my touch, its surface rough and splintered. The hinges shrieked, a sound that tore through the quiet and left my ears ringing. Beyond it, the space opened up into a wide, low-ceilinged chamber. This was it. The very air here felt bruised, heavy with 1,000 unspoken tragedies. This was the intake holding area during power outage. The lantern's feeble glow did little to dispel the gloom, only carving out a small, quivering circle of visibility. The walls, rough-hewn stone, wept with moisture. Chains, thick with rust, hung from heavy iron rings embedded in the rock, swaying almost imperceptibly as if stirred by an unseen breath. My stomach clenched. A low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the stone floor, rising from the very bedrock of the manor. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears so much as felt in my teeth, a deep thrumming that resonated in my chest cavity. It wasn't in English, or any language I recognized, but the meaning was clear, an insidious suggestion of profound, irredeemable failure. It clawed at the edges of my mind, finding purchase in the fertile ground of my own self-doubt. Worthless. Forgotten. Empty. My hands trembled, the lantern shaking so violently I feared it would go out completely. I gripped it tighter, my knuckles white. This was what had been feeding, what had been waiting. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, not a spectral figure. It was something else, something more primal, more insidious. It was the collective despair, the artistic failures, the broken dreams that had been held in this place. It had been drawn to my own struggles, my own creative block, like a shark to blood in the water. It was vast, amorphous, yet I could feel its focus, its malevolent gaze fixed solely on me. Your art is meaningless. Your vision is a lie. You will never create again. The entity was feeding on my fear, on the echo of every rejection, every critical word, every blank canvas I'd stared at for too long. It was the physical manifestation of creative despair, a horror born from the very act of trying to bring beauty into the world and failing. The lantern slipped in my grasp, nearly extinguishing. But then, a flicker of defiance. No. I wouldn't. I had come here to create, to find inspiration, not to become another casualty of this place. It twisted them, amplified them, making them scream inside my head. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing myself to breathe, to push past the suffocating despair. I thought of the feeling of brush on canvas, the vibrant burst of color, the quiet satisfaction of a line perfectly drawn. This was what it wanted to steal. This was what I had to protect. I opened my eyes. The entity had expanded, its formless mass pushing closer, absorbing the last vestiges of light. It wanted me to give up. To surrender. You feed on despair, I said, my voice gaining strength, but I create from it. It was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to reclaim my mind. I focused on the very act of creation, the struggle, the pain, the doubt, not as weaknesses, but as fuel. I pictured a canvas in my mind, stark white, and began to fill it with the grotesque horror before me, not as a victim, but as an observer, an artist. The entity shrieked, a sound that was more a tearing of reality than an audible noise. The chains on the walls rattled violently. The air shimmered. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and frustration. It didn't want to be seen, to be understood, to be captured. It wanted to devour. I was terrified, yes, but there was a fierce, almost manic determination burning within me now. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a battle for my very soul, my identity as an artist. I would not let it win. I would not become another forgotten name in this cursed place.